The city of Patna, known for its bustling streets and rich history, became the backdrop for an unimaginable tragedy that left its community in shock. What was meant to be a joyous celebration of Eid turned into a nightmare, forever altering the lives of two young children and unraveling a dark family secret. Shahnaz, a loving wife and mother, harbored a hidden love that would ultimately lead to her husband's brutal murder. The question on everyone's mind: how could a woman who appeared to have it all betray her family in such a horrific manner? This is the story of love, lies, and the fatal consequences of betrayal. Shahnaz grew up in Patna, surrounded by the warmth of a close-knit family. Her parents, deeply invested in her future, envisioned a life of comfort and stability for their beloved daughter. As she blossomed into a young woman, they began the search for the perfect match, a man who could offer her not just love, but the kind of security and happiness she deserved. After months of careful consideration, they found him, Jafar Udin. A man of quiet ambition, Jafar hailed from the nearby town of Lisari. An electrical engineer by profession, he had secured a prestigious job in Saudi Arabia, a golden opportunity and a sign of the prosperous life he could offer. Shahnaz's parents were convinced he was the one. The proposal was made, and in what seemed like no time, they were planning the grand wedding. The entire town celebrated as the couple tied the knot in a ceremony filled with joy, tradition, and promises of a bright future. For Shahnaz, it seemed like a fairy tale. Jafar was everything her parents had hoped for, a stable, hard-working man who had built a life for himself. Their future together seemed set in stone. Little did anyone know, this perfect union was the beginning of a much darker tale. The newlyweds started their married life in Saudi Arabia, where Jafar worked tirelessly to provide for Shahnaz and their growing family. It seemed like a dream come true. But as time passed, cracks began to form beneath the surface. Their once idyllic life in the desert began to feel distant, and Jafar Udin, despite his success, realized that he yearned for a change. The lure of family, home, and familiarity beckoned him. After years abroad, he decided to move back to India with Shahnaz and their two young sons, looking for a fresh start in Noida, a city on the rise. For 2 years, they lived in Noida, adjusting to the rhythm of a new life. The early days were filled with small joys, a new home, new friends, the quiet satisfaction of settling down. But it wasn't long before something changed again. The arrival of May, and with it the approaching Eid festival, stirred memories of home in Shahnaz's heart. And so the couple decided it was time to visit Patna once again, time to return to where it all began. A visit to Shahnaz's parents' home and the chance to celebrate Eid in their brand-new house next door felt like the perfect occasion. The excitement was palpable. But behind this celebration was a quiet tension, a bubbling unease, one that no one could see coming. As Jafar Udin looked forward to the family reunion, Shahnaz harbored a secret that, when revealed, would tear apart everything she had built, everything she had loved. What began as a simple trip home would soon become the catalyst for a shocking and tragic turn of events. After years spent apart in different countries, Jafar and Shahnaz thought Noida would be their fresh start, a place to settle down, away from the demands of their past. It was supposed to be a new chapter, full of promise and peace. They moved into a quiet neighborhood, raising their 2 young sons while Jafar adjusted to his new job in the bustling city. For a while, it seemed like life was finally falling into place. But life, as it often does, had its own plans. As the days passed and the months grew longer, something shifted in Shahnaz. The connection with her husband, once so strong and hopeful, began to fray at the edges. The bright lights of Noida, the noise of city life, the never-ending bustle. It all seemed to dull the joy that once radiated from their home. Jafar, focused on his work and the stability he was building, noticed the change but attributed it to the stress of their new life. He didn't know that Shahnaz's heart was no longer where it should have been. Then the calendar turned to May, and with it came the familiar feeling of excitement that always accompanied Eid. It was the perfect time for a visit home. They hadn't been back to Patna in years, and with their new house ready next to Shahnaz's family, it felt like the right moment to reconnect. The thought of celebrating the festival in Patna, surrounded by family and tradition, brought a smile to Shahnaz's face. It was a chance to escape the weight of their new life and return to the place where everything had started. But beneath the surface, Shahnaz's mind was elsewhere. As Jafar eagerly planned the trip, she was quietly making her own arrangements that would alter the course of their lives forever. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of freedom, a sense of escape. What was meant to be a joyful reunion would soon become the backdrop for a shocking betrayal that no one could have predicted. The flight was booked, the bags packed, and the family boarded the plane with smiles on their faces. But Shahnaz knew, deep down, that once they touched down in Patna, everything would change. She had one last chance to put her plan into motion, and it was going to be her most dangerous decision yet. The morning of May 3rd arrived, a day that was meant to be filled with laughter, prayers, and the warmth of family. Shahnaz had gone to bed the night before with a sense of relief. Everything was going according to plan. Jafar had been busy shopping for Eid gifts with their sons. The house was quiet, and Shahnaz had managed to slip away to make the final preparations. The day before, the house had been alive with excitement, the smells of biryani and sweets wafting through the air, a perfect picture of a family reuniting for the celebration. But that morning, everything would come to a crushing halt. Shahnaz's elder son, feeling uneasy, woke up before the others. The house was still and silent, the kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. He walked to his father's room, expecting to find Jafar asleep, perhaps still tired from their outing the day before. But what he found was a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Jafar was lying on the floor, motionless, his body twisted in a way that suggested something was terribly wrong. A pressure cooker lay beside him, smeared with blood. The image was horrifying. His father, the man who had always been the protector, the provider, now lifeless, murdered in the very home meant to symbolize new beginnings. Overcome with shock, the young boy screamed in terror, his voice echoing through the house like a death knell. Shahnaz rushed to the scene, her heart racing. The other family members soon arrived, drawn by the screams, only to be greeted by the horrific sight of their loved one lying dead in a pool of his own blood. Neighbors quickly gathered outside, the news spreading like wildfire. It was the day before Eid, a day meant to bring people together in joy. But now it was overshadowed by a tragedy that no one could comprehend. The police arrived quickly, their uniforms standing in stark contrast to the family's grief-stricken faces. They moved with efficiency, taking custody of the body and sending it for a post-mortem. The investigation began immediately, but one question lingered in everyone's mind. Who would want to hurt Jafar Udin, a man who had worked so hard to build a life for his family? And why was he killed on the eve of what should have been a celebration? As the police began their questioning, Shahnaz told them a story, a tale of two strangers breaking into the house, attacking her, stealing her necklace, and then killing Jafar. At first it seemed plausible. After all, robbery had become a common motive for crimes like this. But the more the police dug, the more the story started to unravel. There were too many holes, too many unanswered questions. Shahnaz's story was convincing, but something didn't sit right with the officers. Why, they wondered, would the intruders kill Jafar and leave everything else untouched? The house was filled with valuable items, but nothing had been stolen except for Shahnaz's necklace. It didn't add up. The officers started to consider the possibility that the motive wasn't robbery at all. but something much more personal. As the day wore on, the investigation deepened. With every passing moment, the suspicion grew that this was not the work of random criminals, but a crime born from within the family. Someone close, someone trusted. The question now was, who? The hours passed, and the investigation grew more intense. Shahnaz's story, though tragic, seemed to have too many inconsistencies for the police to ignore. At first, she appeared distraught, her face pale and tear-streaked as she recounted the events. She described how two strangers had broken into the house, violently attacked her, snatched her necklace, and then murdered her husband before fleeing the scene. It was a horrifying story, one that left little room for doubt, but something about her account didn't quite fit. The police, with their years of experience, knew better than to accept a story at face value. They questioned her multiple times, hoping to catch a slip, an inconsistency, or a detail that didn't match. The more they dug, the more the narrative began to fall apart. If it was a robbery, why was only Shahnaz's necklace taken? Why leave behind all the other valuables? Money, jewelry, electronics, none of it had been touched. This simple detail raised a red flag. Robbers didn't leave behind an easy score unless they had a different reason for being there. The officers continued their questioning, now focusing more closely on the events leading up to the murder. Shahnaz's story had always seemed a little too rehearsed, too perfect. She claimed that she had woken up in the middle of the night to strange noises, only to find herself attacked by the intruders. But the details of her attack were vague, and there was no sign of forced entry. No windows were broken, no doors were smashed. It was as if the intruders had been allowed in, or worse, as if they were already inside. The more they learned, the more the possibility grew that this wasn't just a random act of violence. The police began to suspect that the intruders weren't strangers at all. They could have been someone who knew the house intimately, someone who had access, someone within the family perhaps. It was an unsettling thought, but as they scoured the scene, the evidence pointed them in that direction. They asked Shahnaz for her mobile phone to investigate further. At first she hesitated, but then she handed it over without much protest, explaining that it was a gift from her husband. The officers examined the phone closely, combing through call logs and messages in search of anything that might reveal a clue. But when they checked the records, they came up empty. There were no recent calls or messages that raised suspicion. Still, the officers couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The perfect crime story seemed to have too many holes. The investigation wasn't just about finding the killer anymore. It had become a question of motive. What could drive someone to commit such a brutal act in a home that seemed, on the surface, so happy? Shahnaz was adamant that it was a robbery gone wrong, but the evidence suggested otherwise. The police could only wonder, was the truth hiding behind the cracks in her carefully crafted story? As the investigation continued, the officers began to look deeper into Shahnaz's past, her relationships, her history, and any connections that could shed light on why anyone would want to harm her husband. The more they uncovered, the more the case started to take a dark turn. The truth, it seemed, was buried beneath a web of lies, and Shahnaz might be at the center of it all. As the investigation gained momentum, the officers knew they had to peel back every layer of Shahnaz's life to get closer to the truth. Her story was unraveling, and they could feel the tension mounting as they started questioning everyone connected to her. The inconsistencies in her narrative were too striking to ignore, and every new detail pointed them further away from the idea of a random robbery. The detectives were determined to find the cracks in the facade and expose the truth lurking behind the tragedy. One of the first things the police discovered was that there had been no forced entry into the house. Nothing had been tampered with, no broken locks, no shattered windows, nothing that indicated an intruder had entered by force. This was an odd detail. In cases of robbery, the assumption is that burglars are usually in a rush, desperate to get in and out without getting caught. But this was different. Whoever had entered the house had done so calmly, without the chaos of breaking in. It was as if the person knew the layout of the house, knew how to get in without raising any alarms. It was the perfect setup for someone who had been inside before, someone who felt comfortable there. The police now had a chilling theory. This wasn't the work of strangers, but of someone who had been allowed in, perhaps even expected. They started looking into the details of Shahnaz and Jafar Udin's life in Noida, hoping to uncover any leads that might have been overlooked. The couple had lived in the city for 2 years, yet the police were unable to find any friends or acquaintances who had close ties to Jafar. It was almost as if Jafar had kept to himself, focusing entirely on his family and work. In a way, that made sense. He had spent most of his life working far from home, away from the people who might have been in a position to harm him. But it also made the lack of connections suspicious. No one, it seemed, had any personal animosity toward him, leaving the police to wonder if there was something hidden much closer to home. Shahnaz's calm demeanor during the questioning also raised alarms. Despite the tragedy that had befallen her, she seemed to be holding something back. The police began to question her more intensely, trying to catch her in a contradiction. They asked about her relationship with Jafar. Why had they chosen to move to Noida? Why had Jafar left Saudi Arabia? Why had they decided to visit Patna, especially after such a long time? Shahnaz's answers were vague, almost rehearsed. It was when the police began talking to the neighbors and relatives that they stumbled upon a curious detail. This was the first time in 2 years that Jafar had come back to Patna to celebrate Eid with his in-laws. And though he had planned this reunion with excitement, the police couldn't help but wonder, why had he chosen to do it this year? What had changed? What had shifted in the dynamics of their family life to make this visit so crucial? But as they dug deeper, the investigation took an unexpected turn. As much as they focused on Jafar's life and the possible enemies he could have had, they couldn't ignore the one constant, the person who had the most to gain from his death, the person who had the most at stake. The police started looking into her past, her relationships, her history, anything that could explain why she would go to such extremes. What they found shocked them. Shahnaz's love life wasn't as simple and innocent as they had been led to believe. Years before her marriage to Jafar, Shahnaz had been involved with a boy named Kamal. They had been inseparable during their school days, the talk of the town with their open affection for one another. It seemed like a typical school romance, but it quickly escalated into something more intense. Kamal and Shahnaz had fallen deeply in love, but there was a problem. Shahnaz's family didn't approve. Kamal came from a poor background, and Shahnaz's family had big plans for her future. They wanted her to marry a man who could offer her a life of stability and comfort, not someone with no prospects. When Shahnaz's relationship with Kamal became too public, the school stepped in, the principal reprimanding them for their behavior. This led to a fallout that forced Shahnaz to leave her school and attend another, while Kamal continued his education elsewhere. The relationship didn't end there, though. Kamal, driven by love and a determination to marry Shahnaz, began working hard to save money. However, his status never improved in Shahnaz's family's eyes. He was poor, without prospects, and thus not an acceptable match. But Shahnaz, despite the pressures from her family, continued to care for him. Even after she married Jafar, Shahnaz and Kamal stayed in touch. Their bond, though strained by time and distance, never fully disappeared. The more the police uncovered, the more they began to understand the complexity of Shahnaz's emotions and how far she was willing to go to reclaim the love she had once lost. And that's when the investigators started to piece together the shocking reality. Jafar's death was no random act of violence. It was the result of a long-held secret, a burning desire for a life with Kamal, a life that could only be achieved by removing the one obstacle standing in their way. The truth was becoming clearer, and with each new revelation, the investigation grew darker. Shahnaz wasn't just a grieving wife. She was the mastermind behind her husband's brutal murder. The question was no longer whether or not she had a motive, but how far she had gone to cover up the crime. As the investigation dug deeper, the focus slowly shifted from the events surrounding Jafar's death to the life that Shahnaz had lived before the marriage, before the family, before the quiet facade of a perfect home. The police had already begun to suspect that Shahnaz's actions weren't just driven by desperation, but by something deeper, something buried in her past. And as they uncovered more, the layers of Shahnaz's life began to unravel, revealing secrets she had carefully hidden from everyone around her, including her husband. Shahnaz had not always been the doting wife and mother she appeared to be. Before Jafar, there had been Kamal, a name that, when spoken, seemed to evoke memories of rebellion, youthful love, and defiance. Kamal wasn't just any boy. He was the one Shahnaz had loved deeply in her school years, the one her family had never approved of. They had been inseparable, the kind of couple whose love was whispered about in the school hallways. But their love story had ended in tragedy, not because of a lack of feeling, but because of circumstance. Shahnaz's family could not accept the boy who didn't have wealth or status. Their relationship had sparked scandal, drawing the attention of teachers and the principal. When their public displays of affection grew too obvious, they were both expelled from school. But even that couldn't break their bond. Kamal, heartbroken but determined, decided to work to save enough money so that he could marry Shahnaz, believing that one day he would prove himself worthy in her eyes. The relationship between Kamal and Shahnaz had always been known to the people around them, but it had been brushed aside by her family, dismissed as a youthful infatuation. Shahnaz's family was well off, and they had their sights set on a much more suitable match for her, someone educated, stable, and prosperous. So, when Jafar Udin came into the picture, he seemed like the perfect solution. A man with a steady job in Saudi Arabia, with prospects that promised comfort and security. He was everything Shahnaz's parents had hoped for, everything that Kamal, with his limited means, could never be. Shahnaz's marriage to Jafar was arranged, and despite her lingering feelings for Kamal, she went along with it. After all, it was the practical choice, the one that would ensure her future. But as time passed, Shahnaz found it hard to let go of her first love. When Jafar was away in Saudi Arabia for months at a time, Shahnaz and Kamal slowly rekindled their connection. The more Jafar was absent, the closer Shahnaz became to Kamal. They exchanged secret messages, met in hidden corners, and talked about the future they could have if only Jafar were out of the picture. It was a love story that had never truly ended, just paused. Over the next few years, Jafar returned to India only for short visits. And during those brief periods, the cracks in Shahnaz's marriage grew wider. She convinced herself that Jafar would never know the truth about her affair with Kamal. But the tension between her love for Kamal and her duty to Jafar weighed heavily on her. It was clear that her feelings for Kamal hadn't faded with time. In fact, they had grown stronger. When Jafar decided to leave Saudi Arabia and move to Noida, Shahnaz saw it as an opportunity to escape the chaos of her divided heart. But even as they settled into their new life in Noida, Shahnaz continued her secret affair with Kamal, who would visit her frequently when Jafar was away. Kamal even began to play a more troubling role in the family. He was referred to as Abu by Shahnaz's son, a term reserved for fathers. The younger son, too small to understand, picked up on the familiarity and began calling Kamal the same. The dynamic was becoming impossible to ignore, but Shahnaz convinced herself that no one suspected anything. Despite the growing tension, Jafar remained unaware of the affair. He believed that Shahnaz had moved on from Kamal, believing that their life together in Noida had repaired the cracks in their marriage. He thought the worst was behind them. But when Jafar made the decision to celebrate Eid at Shahnaz's family home in Patna, it was as if the stage was set for the final act. Jafar was eager to show his family that he had made it, to show them the new life he had built. Shahnaz, on the other hand, saw the trip as her chance to finish what she had started. Shahnaz knew this was the moment she had been waiting for, her last chance to be with Kamal, to escape the confines of a life she no longer wanted. She used the opportunity of Jafar's absence to put her plan into motion. She had decided that this time she would not just escape with Kamal. She would eliminate the obstacle that stood between them once and for all. What had started as a schoolgirl romance had now become a deadly obsession, one that would lead to the murder of a man who had loved his wife deeply. The twists and turns of Shahnaz's past, the unresolved tension, and the years of hidden betrayal had all led to this fateful moment. And with each passing day, it became more and more clear. The path she had chosen would be her undoing. The truth was becoming more undeniable with every detail the police uncovered. As they pieced together Shahnaz's past, the connection between her and Kamal became even clearer. What had started as a youthful romance had now spiraled into a dangerous obsession, one that she had been feeding quietly, even as she played the role of the devoted wife and mother. It was a secret Shahnaz thought she could keep hidden, but the investigation was starting to expose the cracks in her carefully constructed life. For 2 years, Shahnaz had been living a double life. While Jafar worked tirelessly in Noida, Shahnaz had rekindled her relationship with Kamal, meeting him whenever Jafar was away. Kamal, who had once dreamed of marrying her when they were young, had never let go of that desire. He was patient, waiting for the right time to make his move. But as the years passed, Kamal grew more desperate. He was no longer the same young man who had once dreamed of a future with Shahnaz. His love for her had turned into something darker, a fixation. And Shahnaz, despite her outward appearances, had become just as fixated on him. Every time Jafar left for work, she saw it as an opportunity to be with Kamal. They began to see each other more frequently, sharing stolen moments of passion and planning a future that only they could see. Their love, once innocent, had morphed into something sinister, a plot that would unravel everything Shahnaz had built with Jafar. But Kamal was no fool. He knew that as long as Jafar was alive, he would never truly have Shahnaz. He had seen how Shahnaz had struggled between duty and desire, how she had played the part of a loving wife while her heart belonged to someone else. Kamal was no longer content to wait for the future. He wanted it now. He wanted Shahnaz for himself, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. Shahnaz, now fully consumed by her desire to be with Kamal, began to entertain the unthinkable, eliminating Jafar. It wasn't a fleeting thought, but a calculated decision, one that she believed would free her from the constraints of her life and finally allow her to be with the man she had always loved. She started to plan the murder with meticulous care. Every detail had to be perfect. There could be no room for error. Shahnaz knew that the easiest way to execute her plan was when Jafar was away from home, especially with the Eid celebration approaching. The timing was perfect. When Jafar suggested they visit Patna, it felt like the ideal moment to put everything in motion. She could use the trip as an opportunity to carry out the crime without anyone suspecting a thing. While Jafar was out shopping with the children on the evening of May 2nd, Shahnaz made her move. She secretly called Kamal, inviting him to the house while her husband and sons were away. Kamal arrived, slipping into the house unnoticed. Shahnaz hid him in a room, waiting for the right moment. She needed everything to unfold just as she had planned. The night seemed normal enough. The family had dinner together, Shahnaz, Jafar, and the 2 boys. They laughed, exchanged stories, and enjoyed the final peaceful evening before the holiday. But beneath the calm exterior, Shahnaz's mind was racing, plotting the attack that would change everything. She had already planned to create a distraction, to get Jafar to sleep in a separate room. The tension between them had been building for months, and this was her chance to use it to her advantage. Around 3 a.m., when everyone in the house was deep in sleep, Shahnaz quietly approached Jafar. She had already started a small argument earlier that evening, just enough to spark his frustration. It was a small ruse, but it worked. In a fit of anger, Jafar agreed to sleep in the drawing room, away from Shahnaz and the children. The opportunity was now perfect. Shahnaz quietly left her room, her heart pounding in her chest. She had one last task to complete. She went to the kitchen, grabbed a heavy pressure cooker, and silently made her way back to the drawing room. Kamal, who had been waiting in silence, was already prepared. Together they moved swiftly. Shahnaz held the door open for Kamal, and the two of them attacked Jafar while he lay unsuspecting on the couch. The pressure cooker was heavy, cold, and lethal. With one strike, they hit Jafar hard, the weight of the metal crushing his skull. They continued to strike him until they were sure he was dead. The quiet of the house was shattered by the sound of the blows, but the children remained asleep, unaware of the nightmare unfolding just a few rooms away. When it was done, Kamal quickly left the house, leaving Shahnaz to lock the door behind him. She returned to her room, trying to steady her breath, feeling the adrenaline surge through her body. The plan had worked. Jafar was gone, and nothing would stand between her and Kamal now. The morning came, and the scene was set for the next part of Shahnaz's plan. When her son woke up and discovered the body, she would spin the tale she had carefully crafted, the story of two intruders breaking into the house, attacking her, stealing her necklace, and killing Jafar. It was a story of convenience, a story designed to shift blame, to make her the victim in a tragedy that she had orchestrated from the start. But as the police would soon discover, there were too many holes in Shahnaz's story. Her plan, so carefully devised, was about to fall apart, and the truth was closer to the surface than she realized. The night of May 2nd unfolded with the quiet tension of a well-rehearsed plan, and as the clock struck 3 a.m., Shahnaz moved through the house with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Everything she had meticulously planned was about to come to fruition. There was no turning back. The house was still, the children deep in sleep, unaware of the horror that was about to unfold just a few rooms away. The Eid celebrations were only hours away, but for Shahnaz, this was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when she would break free from the life she no longer wanted. Jafar, exhausted from the day's events, had already agreed to sleep in the drawing room after their argument. He lay there, unaware that his wife, the woman he trusted with his life, was about to turn his world upside down. Shahnaz's heart raced as she quietly moved to the kitchen, grabbed a heavy pressure cooker, and held it in her hands, feeling its cold, unforgiving weight. The decision was final. This would be the weapon to end it all. The simple, mundane tool would become an instrument of death. She had carefully chosen it because it was both inconspicuous and deadly, a tool that would leave no sharp marks, no traceable weapon, just a blunt force trauma that would seem almost accidental. Shahnaz moved back into the drawing room, the only sound the faint rustle of her clothing and the soft thudding of her own heart. Kamal was already there, waiting for her. He had been hiding, out of sight, and now he was part of the final stage of the plan. The two of them had rehearsed this moment in their minds countless times, but now it was real, and there was no turning back. In one swift motion, Kamal approached Jafar, who was still lying unsuspecting, his breath slow and deep in sleep. Without hesitation, Shahnaz and Kamal struck together, the weight of the pressure cooker crashing down onto Jafar's skull. The blow was hard, but they didn't stop there. They continued to hit him, each blow heavier, more desperate, until Jafar's body lay still. They were determined to make sure he was dead, to erase him completely from their lives. The attack was quick, violent, and methodical. As the blood began to spill, the once peaceful home became a crime scene, a house filled with silence and a chilling sense of finality. Shahnaz stood over the lifeless body of her husband, her pulse quickening with a mixture of adrenaline and fear. She had just committed murder, and the weight of what she had done was only beginning to sink in. Once they were sure Jafar was dead, Kamal quickly left the scene, slipping out of the house as quietly as he had entered. Shahnaz locked the door behind him, retreating to her room, trying to steady her breath. The plan had worked. Jafar was gone, and nothing stood between her and Kamal. The children would wake up soon, and everything would unfold according to the story she had already prepared. But as the minutes ticked by, a sense of unease crept in. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She had killed her husband. For Kamal, for the life she had always dreamed of, but at what cost? The reality of her actions began to weigh on her, but she quickly pushed the thoughts aside. There was no going back now. As the first rays of daylight broke through the windows, Shahnaz readied herself for the next stage of her plan. When her son would wake up and find the body, she would be ready with the story, the one that would absolve her and Kamal. She would tell the police about the two intruders who had broken in, attacked her, stolen her necklace, and killed Jafar before fleeing the scene. It was a simple, straightforward story. But it was also a lie. And the cracks in her tale were already starting to show. The morning arrived, and Shahnaz's son, feeling uneasy as he woke up, wandered into his father's room. The sight that met him was one no child should ever have to see. His father's lifeless body, lying in a pool of blood, a pressure cooker beside him. The screams that followed echoed through the house, filling the air with panic and fear. Shahnaz rushed to the scene, her heart pounding in her chest. She did as she had planned, putting on the act of a grieving wife, feigning shock and disbelief. Neighbors quickly gathered, the news spreading like wildfire. It was the day before Eid, a time meant for joy and celebration, but instead the house was filled with sorrow, the family now in mourning. The police arrived soon after, and Shahnaz began to tell them her carefully rehearsed story, describing how two intruders had broken into the house, attacked her, and murdered her husband. It was a story that made sense on the surface, but beneath it, the truth began to slip through the cracks. The police were efficient, moving swiftly to secure the crime scene and question everyone. They were sympathetic but cautious, probing deeper into Shahnaz's account, questioning neighbors and family members. Everything seemed to fall into place until the details didn't add up. The police noticed that there were no signs of forced entry, no valuables taken except for Shahnaz's necklace. The robbery story, so neatly packaged, began to unravel. And with every new question, Shahnaz's composure began to crack, revealing that the story she had spun was as fragile as the lies she had lived. The authorities would soon learn that not everything was as it seemed, and the carefully constructed story of a tragic robbery would give way to a far darker truth. The morning that should have marked the beginning of a joyous Eid celebration instead became a scene of chaos and disbelief. As the police processed the crime scene and questioned Shahnaz and the family, the cracks in her story became undeniable. The investigators, skilled in their craft, quickly realized that the so-called robbery didn't make sense. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing that suggested strangers had broken into the house. The only item taken was Shahnaz's necklace, a piece of jewelry with sentimental value, but not nearly enough to warrant the brutal murder of her husband. As the police continued to examine the evidence, the inconsistencies in Shahnaz's account became impossible to ignore. She had claimed that two intruders had attacked her and killed Jafar, but the absence of any tangible proof to support her story raised suspicions. Why, the police wondered, would the intruders kill someone but leave everything else? money, electronics, and other valuables untouched? Why would they leave without taking anything of significant value? The officers began to suspect that the crime wasn't a random act of violence, but rather something much more personal. The investigation shifted its focus. No longer were the police looking for strangers who had committed a robbery gone wrong. They began to consider that the attackers might have been someone who was familiar with the house, someone who had access and could move freely within the home without arousing suspicion. And that's when the first real breakthrough came. The police began to dig into Shahnaz's past, looking for any possible connections that could explain why her husband, Jafar, was killed. As they questioned family members, friends, and neighbors, the officers started to uncover pieces of Shahnaz's life that she had tried so hard to keep hidden. They learned about her past relationship with Kamal, her high school sweetheart. The two had been inseparable in their younger years, their relationship causing a scandal in the small community. When Shahnaz's parents found out about the relationship, they intervened, putting pressure on the couple to end it. Kamal, who came from a poor family, was not deemed a suitable match for someone from Shahnaz's well-off family. Despite the opposition, Shahnaz and Kamal's feelings for each other didn't fade. Kamal, determined to marry her, worked hard to save enough money, believing that one day he could prove his worth to her family. But the relationship remained a thorn in Shahnaz's side. Her family pushed her to marry Jafar, a man with a promising career and a secure future. And so she did, leaving Kamal behind. But their connection never fully died. Even after her marriage to Jafar, Shahnaz and Kamal continued to communicate in secret, meeting whenever Jafar was away for work. The more the police investigated, the more it became clear that Shahnaz had never fully let go of Kamal. She had rekindled the relationship, and over time the affair became more intense. They would exchange secret messages, meet in hidden places, and eventually Shahnaz began to dream of a life with Kamal, free from the constraints of her marriage. When Jafar moved to Noida, leaving her alone for long stretches, Shahnaz's relationship with Kamal grew stronger. The two began meeting more frequently, and Shahnaz even began to refer to Kamal as Abu, the term for father, in front of her children. But it wasn't just an affair anymore. It had become a dangerous obsession. Shahnaz's feelings for Kamal were no longer innocent. She saw him as her escape, the man who could offer her the life she had always desired. The more she believed her marriage to Jafar was failing, the more her desire to be with Kamal intensified. She couldn't shake the feeling that Jafar was in the way, standing between her and the life she truly wanted. As the investigation unfolded, the police began to connect the dots. Shahnaz had planned the murder carefully, knowing that Jafar's absence on aid would be the perfect opportunity. When they examined her phone records, they discovered a second phone that Shahnaz had been using to communicate with Kamal in secret. The records on that phone were damning. The couple had planned Jafar's murder in advance. Shahnaz had already arranged for Kamal to come to the house while Jafar was out shopping, and together they had executed the murder with chilling precision. Shahnaz's carefully constructed alibi, her story of two intruders, fell apart once the police uncovered the hidden phone and the incriminating call records. The evidence was clear. Shahnaz and Kamal had orchestrated the murder together, and the police now had the proof they needed to make an arrest. On May 10, 2022, both Shahnaz and Kamal were arrested. The truth had been exposed, and the shocking betrayal had been revealed. The case quickly became a sensation in Patna, with the entire community shocked by the brutality of the crime and the deception that had led to it. The once loving wife and mother had been unmasked as the mastermind behind her husband's murder, and the man who had once been her secret lover was now complicit in the crime. The trial began shortly thereafter, and the details of the murder continued to shock and appall everyone who followed the case. Shahnaz and Kamal both faced charges of murder, conspiracy, and other crimes related to the death of Jafar Udin. The trial, which is still ongoing, has captivated the public's attention as people struggle to comprehend how a woman who appeared to have it all could so easily destroy the life she had built for herself and her children. Meanwhile, Jafar's two young sons were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. They were now fatherless, left to grow up without the man who had worked so hard to provide for them. The emotional toll of the crime would stay with them forever, a painful reminder of the day that their mother's lies turned into a tragic reality. Shahnaz and Kamal now sit in Patna jail, their fates uncertain as the legal process continues. It is still unclear how long they will remain behind bars, but one thing is certain: the damage caused by their actions will echo for years to come. Jafar's death may have brought an end to his life, but it has left a hole in the lives of everyone who knew him, a hole that can never truly be filled. The arrest of Shahnaz and Kamal sent shockwaves through Patna. What had begun as a family tragedy on the eve of Eid had escalated into one of the most shocking criminal cases in recent memory. The community, once in disbelief, now followed every detail of the trial, desperate to understand how a woman who seemed to have everything, a family, a loving husband, 2 children, could betray them all in such a horrific way. The courtroom was filled with tension as Shahnaz and Kamal stood before the judge. Shahnaz, once the picture of grace and dignity, now appeared a shadow of the woman she had once been. Her face, once filled with the warmth of motherhood and devotion, was now hardened, her eyes cold as she sat through the proceedings. Kamal, who had once been her secret lover, now sat quietly beside her, his face expressionless, but his guilt evident in the way he avoided eye contact with the court. The prosecution laid out the case, presenting evidence that Shahnaz and Kamal had meticulously planned Jafar's murder. They revealed the secret phone records, the incriminating messages between the two conspirators, and the chilling details of how they had executed the crime with precision. The plan had been in motion for months, carefully executed during a brief window of time when Jafar's absence left him vulnerable. Witnesses testified about Shahnaz's increasingly strained relationship with her husband and her obsession with Kamal. Friends and family revealed how she had never fully let go of her past love and how her marriage to Jafar had become a battleground between duty and desire. It became clear to the court that this murder was not just about money or revenge. It was about Shahnaz's desire to control her own fate and escape the life she had built. The prosecution argued that she had seen Jafar as nothing more than an obstacle standing in the way of the life she wanted with Kamal. In their defense, Shahnaz and Kamal's lawyers tried to paint a different picture, one of a troubled marriage, of a woman pushed to the brink by her own circumstances. They tried to claim that Shahnaz had acted in the heat of the moment, that the murder had been a desperate act fueled by her emotional turmoil. But the evidence was damning. The planning, the methodical execution of the crime, the coldness with which they had carried out the murder, it all pointed to premeditation, not a spur-of-the-moment decision. As the trial progressed, Shahnaz's defense began to crumble. Her own statements, once so confident, began to show cracks. The story she had crafted to deceive the police of 2 robbers breaking into the house and killing her husband fell apart under scrutiny. The inconsistencies, the lack of evidence to support her version of events, left her with little to stand on. Kamal, too, faced the consequences of his actions. The court listened as the prosecution outlined his role in the crime, highlighting how he had eagerly participated in the murder, knowing full well what they were doing and the devastating consequences it would have for Jafar's family. The final verdict is still to be reached, but the emotional toll of the case has been undeniable. Jafar's family, once filled with hope for the future, now faces a future without him. His children, forever marked by the loss of their father, must now grapple with the harsh reality of their mother's betrayal. Shahnaz's actions, motivated by a selfish desire for love and escape, have irreparably altered the course of their lives. As for Shahnaz and Kamal, their fate now lies in the hands of the court. They are both facing charges of murder and conspiracy, and the weight of their actions will be reflected in the verdict. Shahnaz, who had once been the woman who seemingly had it all, now faces the consequences of a life built on lies and betrayal. Kamal, who had once dreamed of a future with Shahnaz, now finds himself as a co-conspirator in one of the most tragic murders Patna has seen. The trial may be ongoing, but one thing is clear. The damage has already been done. The life that Shahnaz and Jafar had built together is now gone, and the consequences of her choices will reverberate for years to come. The real tragedy of this case isn't just the death of a man, but the destruction of an entire family, torn apart by love, lies, and betrayal. As the trial continues, the question on everyone's mind is, what kind of justice will be served for Jafar, a man who worked hard for his family and who lost everything in a moment of deadly betrayal? And how long will it take for Shahnaz and Kamal to truly face the full weight of their crime? For now, the courtroom drama continues, but the story of this tragic crime will be remembered far beyond the final verdict. The case of Shahnaz and Kamal is a tragic reminder of the destructive power of unchecked desires and the lengths people will go to when they feel trapped by their own choices. What began as a story of love, betrayal, and secrecy has ended in a devastating loss. A life taken, a family shattered, and the promise of a future dashed. Jafar Udin, a man who had worked tirelessly to build a life for his family, became the ultimate victim of a betrayal so profound that it defied belief. His death was not only the result of violence, but of a broken marriage, a love rekindled in secret, and a wife who saw no other way to escape her reality. As the trial continues, it's clear that this case will haunt Patna for years to come. The brutality of the crime, coupled with the carefully orchestrated lies and manipulations, has left the community reeling. And for Shahnaz and Kamal, the consequences of their actions are only just beginning. What began as a misguided attempt to escape will now define the rest of their lives as they face the weight of their decisions in court and beyond. But amidst the sorrow and shock, there is a broader truth that must be acknowledged. Betrayal, at its core, is not just an act of violence against one person. It's an act that tears apart everyone involved. Shahnaz's children, left fatherless and scarred by the horror of their mother's actions, will carry the weight of this tragedy for the rest of their lives. The community, once a place of warmth and familiarity, is now marked by a dark stain that will be difficult to erase. In the end, Jafar's death serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of trust and the devastating impact that deceit can have. His tragic end leaves us questioning the lengths we are willing to go for love and whether the cost of such a pursuit is ever truly worth it. And for Shahnaz and Kamal, the true punishment may not lie in the prison sentences they face, but in the knowledge that their lives, once filled with dreams and possibilities, have now been reduced to nothing but a cautionary tale. The only certainty left in the wake of this tragedy is that the consequences of their actions will ripple through time, leaving behind a legacy of loss, heartache, and a profound reminder of the dangers of hidden desires.